Before we enter the cities, before we walk through the markets, before we meet the families who built their lives here, let us begin with a river. For centuries, rivers have carried more than goods. They have carried languages, ideas, memories, and people searching for a new place to call home. This is the Mekong River, a river that has connected kingdoms, cultures, and communities across mainland Southeast Asia for generations. Somewhere along these waters, Chinese merchants first began arriving in Cambodia. They came not as conquerors, but as traders, carrying silk, ceramics, medicine, and everyday goods. In return, they found opportunities in a land shaped by the ancient civilization of the Khmer people. Some would return to China after their journeys ended. Others would stay. They opened shops, raised families, built communities, and slowly became part of the story of Cambodia itself. When we look at this map, we are not simply looking at borders. Borders change, kingdoms rise and fall. But trade routes often survive. For centuries, merchants from southern China traveled through the waters of the South China Sea and along the rivers of mainland Southeast Asia. They came from Fujian, Guangdong, and Hainan. They brought with them not only goods, but also languages, customs, beliefs, and traditions. Their journeys formed the beginning of a story that would continue for generations. By the early 20th century, Phnom Penh had become a meeting place of many worlds. Khmer traditions, French colonial influence, and Chinese commercial networks. Along the waterfront, languages mixed. A merchant might speak Chinese at home, Khmer with his neighbors, and French when dealing with colonial officials. The city itself became a living crossroads. Stay with this photograph for a moment. Behind this simple shop front is an entire world. These were not merely merchants, they were fathers and mothers, sons and daughters, neighbors, members of a community that was slowly taking root. History often remembers kings and battles, but the story of a diaspora is written in quieter places, in homes, in shops, in family photographs like this one. This is where our journey begins. The history of the Chinese in Cambodia. When newcomers arrive in a foreign land, the first question is always the same. Will they remain strangers? Or will they become neighbors? In Cambodia, Chinese merchants gradually became part of the rhythm of everyday life. They opened small shops along rivers and roads. They traded rice, salt, cloth, ceramics, medicine, and household goods. Their businesses connected villages with cities and farmers with markets. But commerce was only the beginning. A community is not built by trade alone. It is built by relationships. Behind every shop was a network of trust. A merchant needed suppliers, customers, partners, and people who knew his name. These handwritten ledgers reveal something that official histories often overlook. History was not only created in royal courts, it was also created behind shop counters. Every entry in a ledger represents a transaction. Every transaction represents a relationship. This photograph captures a moment of pride. The family has dressed carefully. Everyone is arranged formally. The photographer's studio was not merely a place to take pictures. It was a place where families recorded their achievements. For immigrant communities, photographs carried a special meaning. They were proof that a journey had been completed, proof that a new home had been built. The shop house became one of the most recognizable symbols of Chinese life across Southeast Asia. It was both home and workplace. The family lived above. The business operated below. Children grew up surrounded by the sounds of commerce. The opening of shutters in the morning, the weighing of goods, conversations between neighbors. A shop was not merely a place of business, it was the center of family life. Take a closer look at this photograph. There are no famous people here, no great events, no grand monuments, yet this may be one of the most important images in our entire journey. Because this is how communities are built, not in a single moment, but slowly, one shop, one family, one generation after another. The Chinese who arrived in Cambodia were not simply passing through. Many had found a place where they would build their homes, raise their children, and become part of the story of this land. A community needs more than a place to trade. It needs a place to remember. Across Cambodia, Chinese immigrants built temples and associations that became the spiritual and social centers of their communities. These were places where people prayed, celebrated festivals, honored their ancestors, and gathered together during moments of joy and hardship. For migrants living far from their ancestral villages, these buildings became bridges between two worlds: the homeland they left behind and the new home they were building. One of the deepest traditions carried by Chinese communities overseas was the remembrance of ancestors. Migration separated families from their original villages, but it did not erase their connections. Names were recorded, lineages were remembered, stories were passed from grandparents to grandchildren. In these quiet temple halls, generations who never met could still remain connected. Beyond temples, Chinese communities also created associations based on shared ancestry, language, and place of origin. These organizations helped newcomers find accommodation, assisted families in difficulty, settled disputes, and supported the next generation. To outsiders, a clan association might appear simply as a meeting hall, but to the community, it was a safety net. It was where people knew they belonged. Perhaps the most important institution was the school, because language is one of the strongest links between generations. In these classrooms, children learn Chinese characters, traditional stories, and cultural practices passed down from their ancestors. At the same time, they were growing up in Cambodia. They spoke the languages of their neighbors. They experienced Khmer society. They were becoming part of two worlds at once. Festivals transformed streets into places of memory. During Chinese New Year, communities came together, lanterns were hung, incense was offered, children watched performances that their grandparents had also watched decades earlier. These celebrations were not simply about tradition, they were reminders that although people had crossed oceans and borders, they carried pieces of home with them. Stay with this photograph. Look carefully at the faces. The grandparents belong to a world their grandchildren may never have seen. The children belong to a future that their grandparents could hardly have imagined. Between them stands a bridge, a family, a community, a shared memory. This is how culture survives, not because traditions remain unchanged, but because each generation chooses what to carry forward. By the early 20th century, Phnom Penh was changing. The city that had grown along the river was becoming a colonial capital. French administrators built new roads, government buildings, and modern infrastructure. But beneath this new colonial appearance, the old rhythms continued. Boats still arrived on the Mekong, markets still open each morning, and Chinese merchants continue to play a vital role in connecting Cambodia to wider trading networks. The shop house remained at the heart of Chinese Cambodian life. These buildings were more than places of business. They were spaces where cultures met. A customer might enter speaking Khmer, a merchant might respond in Chinese, a colonial official might record the transaction in French. 3 languages, 3 cultures, 1 street. Newspapers reveal another side of history. They show us not only famous events, but everyday ambitions. A shopkeeper advertising his goods, a family business announcing its services, a merchant hoping to attract new customers. These small advertisements tell us something important. Chinese communities were not living on the margins of Cambodian society. They were active participants in its economic life. This portrait represents a generation that had learned to navigate multiple worlds. They inherited traditions from China, they lived in Cambodia, and they adapted to a colonial society shaped by European influence. Their identity was not a simple choice between one culture and another. It was layered, complex, and constantly evolving. Markets were where Cambodia's different communities met. Here, there were no separate histories. Everyone depended on one another. Farmers brought produce, traders distributed goods, customers created demand. The marketplace became a shared space where Chinese, Khmer, and other communities interacted every day. Stay with this photograph. Look beyond the buildings. Look beyond the clothing. Look at the people. This was a generation standing at the crossroads of history. They were connected to an ancient civilization across the sea. They were living in Cambodia transformed by colonial rule, and they were preparing their children for a future that none of them could fully predict. The 20th century had brought opportunity, but it would also bring challenges that would test the resilience of every community in Cambodia. In 1953, Cambodia entered a new chapter. After decades of French colonial rule, the country became independent. For Chinese Cambodians, independence brought both opportunity and uncertainty. They had built their lives in Cambodia. Their businesses operated in Cambodian towns. Their children had grown up on Cambodian soil. But a new nation was asking an important question. What did it mean to belong? The 1950s and 1960s were years of optimism. Cambodia was building its own future. Cities expanded. Education grew. New businesses emerged. Chinese Cambodian families continued their traditional occupations in trade and commerce, while younger generations entered new professions. They were no longer simply newcomers. They were Cambodian citizens whose roots now stretched across generations. Education became one of the most important ways communities preserve identity. In Chinese schools, students learn language, literature, and traditions inherited from previous generations. But they were also growing up in a changing Cambodia. They studied alongside national developments. They participated in Cambodian society. Their identity was becoming increasingly layered. Chinese by heritage, Cambodian by home. Newspapers revealed that Chinese Cambodian life was closely connected to the wider society around it. Community events were reported, businesses were featured, Schools and associations continued their activities. This was a period when many families believed that their future was secure. But history would soon take a darker turn. Looking back at these old photographs, we see a city full of confidence. Phnom Penh was a place where different communities lived side by side. Khmer traditions, Chinese commerce, French architectural influence, modern aspirations. It was a city looking toward the future. But the future that arrived would be very different from what many expected. Stay with this photograph. This may have been an ordinary family moment, a gathering at home, a celebration, a day that seemed unremarkable, but history often turns ordinary moments into precious memories. The people in this photograph could not know what was coming. They could not know how dramatically Cambodia would change. They could not know how many families would be separated, displaced, or forced to begin again. Yet this photograph survives. A reminder that before history becomes tragedy, there were always people living ordinary lives. Every museum has a gallery where the lights became dimmer, not because the story is less important, but because some memories require a quieter voice. In April 1975, the Khmer Rouge entered Phnom Penh. The city that had once been filled with markets, schools, temples, and family businesses was transformed overnight. Millions of people were forced from their homes. Families were separated. Entire communities were uprooted. Among them were the Chinese Cambodians whose presence in the country stretched back generations. For generations, the shophouse had represented stability. It was where families worked, where children grew up, where neighbors gathered. Now, many stood silent. Behind these doors were memories of ordinary life, a merchant's ledger, a family's belongings, photographs of children, objects that suddenly became reminders of a world that had disappeared. When people were forced to leave, they rarely carry much. Perhaps a few documents, a family photograph, a small personal object. These fragile items became witnesses. They preserve names, relationships, memories. They remind us that behind every historical event are millions of individual lives. History books often describe events through dates. April 1975, the fall of Phnom Penh, the beginning of a new regime. But for families, history was experienced differently. It was the moment a familiar street disappeared, the moment a home was left behind, the moment a future became uncertain. This photograph was taken before the darkness arrived. The people in it were not thinking about history, they were thinking about everyday things: work, school, family, tomorrow. That is why photographs matter. They preserve the moments when life was still ordinary. They allow us to remember not only what happened, but what existed before it happened. Stay with this photograph, not because it shows tragedy, but because it shows life. These faces belonged to a family. They had names, they had dreams, they had memories. Some survived, some left Cambodia, some never returned. But this photograph remained, a small piece of a world that was almost forgotten. And that is why we preserve these memories, not only to remember suffering, but to remember the people who lived through it. History does not end when conflict ends. For those who survive, another journey begins. As Cambodia slowly emerged from years of turmoil, people began returning to the places they once called home. Some found familiar streets, others found only memories. The task before them was enormous. They were not simply rebuilding buildings, they were rebuilding lives. Some families returned to businesses that no longer existed. Others started again from almost nothing. A borrowed table, a few shelves, whatever goods could be found. Across Cambodia, small family enterprises quietly reappeared. One shop at a time, one customer at a time, one day at a time. As stability slowly returned, so too did places of worship. Temples reopened. Incense once again drifted through their courtyards. These were more than religious spaces. They were places where communities could gather once more, places where memories could be shared, and where traditions, interrupted but not forgotten, could begin again. Community organizations also slowly returned. Their work was humble, helping families reconnect, supporting local schools, organizing festivals, preserving traditions that had survived despite years of silence. Their greatest achievement was perhaps not what they built, but what they helped people remember. The strongest sign of recovery was not found in official ceremonies. It was found in ordinary mornings, shops opening their doors, children walking to school, neighbors greeting one another, markets filling with conversation. History had not erased the community, it had tested it. Stay with this photograph. Look at the faces. They have known uncertainty. They have known loss. Yet they have also known perseverance. Every generation inherits something from the one before it. Sometimes prosperity, sometimes hardship, but always the responsibility to continue the story. This family is not remarkable because it survived alone. It is remarkable because it represents thousands of families who quietly rebuilt their lives across Cambodia. Their greatest monument was never a building. It was the next generation. Some traditions can be interrupted, but the strongest traditions are never forgotten. As Cambodia entered a more peaceful era, Chinese festivals once again became part of everyday life. Lanterns returned to the streets, lion dances echoed through neighborhoods, families gathered around reunion dinners. These celebrations were more than festivals. They were declarations that memory had endured. Temples once again became gathering places. Incense rose gently through the courtyards. Elderly worshippers stood beside young children. Traditions that had nearly fallen silent were now being passed on to another generation. In these quiet moments, history became something lived, not merely remembered. Language also found its way back into classrooms. Across Cambodia, Chinese language education experienced a renewed interest. Some students hoped to preserve their heritage. Others recognized new opportunities as China's economy became increasingly connected with the region. For many families, learning Chinese was no longer simply about remembering the past, it was also about preparing for the future. Community associations also found new purpose. They organized cultural events, supported education, assisted families in need, and preserved customs that had traveled across generations. Their work reminded people that heritage is not preserved by buildings alone. It is preserved by people who chose to keep it alive. Commerce once again became a bridge between communities. Chinese Cambodian entrepreneurs contributed to a rapidly changing economy. New businesses appeared, old family enterprises adapted. Streets that had once fallen silent were again filled with conversation. History had not stood still, neither had the people. Stay with this photograph. 4 generations. Each has inherited a different Cambodia. One remembers the colonial era, another remembers hardship, another remembers rebuilding, and the youngest knows only the confidence of the present. Yet they all share the same family table, the same stories, the same traditions. History has shaped every generation differently, but it has not broken the thread that binds them together. Our journey began with a small merchant boat arriving on the banks of the Mekong. It brings us here, to the Cambodia of today. The Chinese community is no longer a story of newcomers. It is part of the fabric of the nation itself. Generations have been born here, lives have been built here, memories continue to be made here. Walk through Phnom Penh today, and history quietly accompanies you. A family business that has served customers for generations, a temple tucked between modern buildings, a festival celebrated each new year. The past has not disappeared, it has simply become part of everyday life. Young people today inherited opportunities that grandparents could scarcely have imagined. Chinese school education has expanded, cultural exchanges have increased. Cambodia's growing connection with the wider region have created new possibilities. Yet every lesson learned today is also linked to generations who work to preserve their heritage through far more difficult times. Heritage is not preserved because it is old. It is preserved because each generation chooses to pass it on. A prayer, a family recipe, a festival, a language, a story told by grandparents to grandchildren. Civilization survives one generation at a time. There is no single story that defines the Chinese in Cambodia. Some families trace their ancestry to Teochew-speaking merchants, others to Cantonese, Hokkien, Hainanese, or Hakka communities. Some arrived generations ago, others more recently. Together, they form one chapter in the larger story of Cambodia itself. Stay with this photograph. Every family carries an album. Some photographs are bright, others have faded. Some pages tell stories of hope, others preserve memories of hardship. But every page belongs to the same story. The history of the Chinese in Cambodia is not simply the history of migration. It is the history of people who crossed rivers, built homes, raised families, endured unimaginable hardship, and continued to contribute to the country they came to call home. But as we leave this gallery, remember that history is not only built in kings, governments, and wars. It is also found in ordinary families, in old photographs, and in the quiet determination to preserve what matters. And perhaps somewhere in Cambodia today, another family is taking a photograph, unaware that one day it too may become part of history.